The biggest mistakes do not begin with cruelty. They begin with certainty. The certainty that you already know who someone is before they ever speak a single word. The charity gala occupied the top 3 floors of one of the most expensive hotels in Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings 40 feet above the marble floor. A pianist played softly near the grand staircase. Men in custom suits discussed investments worth millions of dollars, while women in elegant gowns moved through the crowd beneath golden light. Everything looked perfect. That was exactly why I felt out of place. I stood near the entrance holding a simple black clutch and silently wondered whether accepting the invitation had been a mistake. My navy blue dress was beautiful but modest. No designer labels. No diamonds. No attempt to impress anyone. I had never cared much about those things. Unfortunately, events like this often seemed built around them. I checked my phone. The message that brought me there remained open. A personal invitation. Short. Professional. Important. The sender was one of the few people whose requests I rarely ignored. Yet as the crowd continued growing around me, I found myself questioning the decision. Across the ballroom stood Adrian Russo. Everyone knew his name. Some knew him as a business magnate. Others whispered different descriptions when they thought nobody could hear. Regardless of what people believed, one fact remained undeniable. When Adrian Russo entered a room, attention followed him. He stood surrounded by investors, politicians, executives, and socialites. The center of gravity seemed to shift wherever he walked. I noticed him only briefly before looking away. Men like Adrian Russo existed in a different world from mine. At least that was what I assumed. A waiter carrying champagne passed beside me. I stepped aside to make room and accidentally brushed against a decorative display near the entrance. One of the floral arrangements shifted slightly. Nothing broke. Nothing fell. Yet several nearby guests immediately turned toward the sound. I straightened the display and quietly apologized to the event coordinator standing nearby. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the conversation. Calm. Sharp. Public. Perhaps guests should be invited based on qualifications instead of curiosity. Silence spread faster than I thought possible. My stomach tightened instantly. I turned toward the speaker. Adrian Russo was looking directly at me. The surrounding guests laughed politely. Some smiled. Others pretended not to notice what had just happened. I felt every eye in the room move toward me. Adrian's expression remained unreadable. He clearly assumed I was someone who had wandered into an event where I did not belong. Someone hoping to experience luxury for a night. Someone insignificant. For a moment, I considered correcting him, explaining why I was there, producing the invitation in my purse, defending myself. Instead, I did none of those things. I simply met his gaze, offered a small polite smile, and walked away. The ballroom slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed. Music continued. Yet something strange happened as I crossed the room. I could feel Adrian watching me. Not with satisfaction, not with victory, with confusion. Because while everyone else seemed ready to forget the moment, the man who had spoken those words suddenly looked as though he was beginning to wonder whether he had made a mistake. The strange thing about humiliation is that the people who cause it often forget it first. The people who receive it never do. I moved through the ballroom with the same calm expression I had worn moments earlier, but my pulse was impossible to ignore. Not because Adrian Russo's comment had hurt my feelings. I had experienced far worse things in life than the opinion of a wealthy stranger. What unsettled me was how easily an entire room had accepted his judgment. One sentence, one assumption, and suddenly hundreds of people believed they understood exactly who I was. I stopped near one of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The city glowed beneath the night sky like a sea of stars. From this height, every problem seemed smaller, simpler. I wished that feeling lasted longer. Behind me, conversations gradually returned to normal. The pianist continued playing. Champagne glasses clinked softly. The gala moved forward as though nothing had happened. Perhaps for everyone else, nothing had. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Miss Parker. I turned and smiled immediately. Good evening, Senator Whitmore. The elderly man approached with genuine warmth. I was beginning to think you would not come. I almost did not. His expression softened knowingly. I am glad you changed your mind. We spoke for several minutes. The conversation felt easy, comfortable. Unlike most guests, Senator Whitmore treated everyone with equal respect regardless of status. That quality explained why people trusted him. As we talked, I noticed several nearby attendees watching with growing curiosity. Apparently, they found it strange that one of the most influential senators in the country knew my name. The curiosity intensified when two prominent business leaders joined us moments later. Then a philanthropist. Then the director of a major foundation. One by one, respected figures approached and greeted me as though we were old friends. None of it surprised me. Many of these relationships stretched back years. What surprised me was the expression appearing on faces throughout the ballroom. Confusion. Across the room, Adrian Russo noticed it too. I felt his gaze several times. Every time I looked up, he seemed to be watching. Not openly. Not obviously. Just enough to suggest his confidence was beginning to crack. Eventually, one of his associates leaned toward him and said something. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. The man spoke again. Adrian glanced toward me immediately afterward. The first hint of concern crossed his face. Good. Let him wonder. Let him spend one evening questioning assumptions the way so many other people were forced to do every day. A few minutes later, the ballroom entrance opened again. The reaction was immediate. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Even seasoned politicians straightened their posture. An older gentleman entered surrounded by several executives and security personnel. He carried himself with quiet authority, the kind that never needed to announce itself. The moment he saw me, he smiled. A genuine smile. Then he walked directly across the ballroom, toward me. Every eye followed, including Adrian's. The gentleman stopped beside me and kissed my cheek affectionately. Olivia, he said warmly. There you are. I have been looking everywhere for you. I laughed softly. I was enjoying the view. The man turned toward the surrounding guests. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce someone very special. Silence spread across the room. Complete silence. And for the first time all evening, Adrian Russo looked genuinely uncertain about what was about to happen next. The moment people realize they were wrong is rarely dramatic. It happens in their eyes first. I watched it spread through the ballroom one expression at a time. The older gentleman standing beside me was Charles Parker, founder of one of the largest charitable foundations in the country. Business leaders sought his approval. Universities named buildings after him. Entire communities benefited from his generosity. More importantly, he happened to be my grandfather. Olivia serves on the foundation's board, he said warmly. She also oversees several of our education programs. The silence that followed felt heavier than any speech. Around us, guests exchanged surprised glances. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked fascinated. A few immediately began reassessing every assumption they had made about me during the evening. I hated when that happened. Not because I enjoyed being underestimated. Because people often treated respect like something that had to be earned through status instead of basic decency. Charles continued speaking with several guests while I stood quietly beside him. Across the room, Adrian Russo remained perfectly still. Yet even from a distance, I could see the tension in his posture. Someone said something to him. Another associate leaned closer. Adrian barely reacted. His attention remained fixed on one person. Me. For the first time all night, the most powerful man in the ballroom looked uncertain. Eventually the conversations resumed. Music returned. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays. The gala continued. But the atmosphere had changed. Completely. People who ignored me earlier now approached with smiles and introductions. Business executives suddenly wanted my opinion. Socialites became curious about my work. None of it felt genuine. It felt like a performance. I answered politely anyway. My grandfather always taught me that character mattered most when other people disappointed you. An hour later, I stepped onto a quiet terrace overlooking the city. The cool night air felt refreshing after the crowded ballroom. Manhattan glittered beneath me. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon. For a few minutes, I enjoyed the silence. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Olivia. Adrian's voice sounded different now. Less certain. I faced the skyline instead of him. Mr. Russo. A long pause followed. I owe you an apology. There it was. The moment most people would celebrate. The powerful man admitting he was wrong. The public correction everyone secretly hoped for. Yet I felt strangely empty. Because the apology was not what mattered. What mattered was what happened before it. Adrian stepped closer. Not enough to invade my space. Just enough to show sincerity. I made assumptions. His voice remained calm. And I was wrong. I nodded. Yes. The honesty seemed to surprise him. Good. It should. Another silence settled between us. The city wind moved softly across the terrace. Somewhere below, a siren echoed through the streets. Adrian looked toward the skyline. You could have corrected me. I finally turned to face him. Would it have changed anything? He did not answer immediately. The truth hung between us. No, it would not have. Because the problem was never a lack of information. The problem was that he had already decided who I was before learning anything at all. For the first time that evening, Adrian looked genuinely disappointed in himself. And somehow, that expression stayed with me far longer than the apology ever could. Regret is a strange thing. It does not arrive all at once. It grows quietly every time you replay a moment and wish you had been a different person. The gala ended shortly after midnight. Guests returned to their penthouses and private cars. The music stopped. The chandeliers dimmed. Yet long after I arrived home, I found myself thinking about Adrian Russo standing on that terrace. Not because of the apology, because of the look in his eyes when he realized the truth. For the first time since we met, he had looked uncertain. Human. I made tea and sat beside the window of my apartment overlooking the East River. The city lights reflected across the dark water. Normally moments like this help me clear my thoughts. Tonight they only raised more questions. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, Adrian stood alone inside the top-floor office of Russo Holdings. The skyline stretched around him in every direction. His chief advisor, Marcus Hale, reviewed several reports from the evening before finally setting them aside. You have been staring at that window for 20 minutes, Marcus said. Adrian did not answer immediately. Do you know what bothers me? Marcus leaned back. The fact that you were wrong? Adrian almost smiled. That too. Silence settled between them. Finally, Adrian spoke again. Everyone in that room followed my lead. Marcus nodded. They usually do. Adrian looked toward the city. That is the problem. The word surprised even him. Because for years he had built an empire on confidence. Quick decisions. Fast judgments. Absolute certainty. Yet one careless assumption had revealed a flaw he could no longer ignore. The next morning, my life returned to normal. At least on the surface. Meetings. Foundation work. Community projects. Endless emails. By lunchtime, the gala already felt like a distant memory. Then my assistant entered carrying a small envelope. This was delivered by courier. I accepted it with curiosity. No logo. No branding. Just my name written neatly across the front. Inside was a handwritten note. For simple sentences. Miss Parker, my apology last night was incomplete. I judged you before I knew you. I intend to do better. Adrian Russo. I read it twice. Then a third time. Most powerful people preferred excuses. Adrian had sent none. No justification. No explanation. Just accountability. That caught my attention more than I wanted to admit. Days passed. Then a week. I assumed the matter was finished. Until I attended a fundraising luncheon downtown. The ballroom was smaller than the gala, but equally elegant. Community leaders filled the room. Donors discussed upcoming projects. I was reviewing event materials when a familiar voice interrupted my concentration. Olivia. I looked up. Adrian stood a few feet away. No entourage. No audience. No performance. Just him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he glanced at the folder in my hands. Education initiative? I nodded cautiously. Scholarship program. His eyes brightened slightly. Tell me about it. The request caught me off guard. Most people asked about influence. Connections. Prestige. Adrian asked about the work itself. For the next 20 minutes, he listened. Really listened. Not waiting for his turn to speak. Not trying to impress anyone. Just listening. And as I watched the man who once believed he understood me after 10 seconds of observation, I realized something unexpected. He was trying to become someone better than the person he had been that night. Respect cannot be demanded. It can only be earned. That was the lesson Adrian Russo seemed determined to learn. Over the next several weeks, our paths crossed more often than either of us expected. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. New York was full of charity events, fundraising dinners, and business gatherings. People in our circles occasionally occupied the same rooms. Yet after the fourth event in 3 weeks, even I stopped believing in coincidence. The difference was that Adrian never pushed. He never asked for forgiveness. Never reminded me of his apology. Never attempted to explain away his mistake. Instead, he listened. At every event, every meeting, every conversation, he listened more than he spoke. It was unsettling. Men like Adrian were usually surrounded by people competing for attention, people eager to impress them. Yet whenever we spoke, he seemed interested in everyone except himself. One afternoon, we attended a scholarship review meeting at a community center in Brooklyn. The building was modest. The chairs did not match. The coffee was terrible. I loved everything about it. Students presented ideas for future education programs, while volunteers discussed funding needs. Most wealthy donors stayed for 30 minutes before leaving. Adrian stayed for 4 hours. For hours. He listened to every presentation, shook every hand, thanked every volunteer. By the end of the day, several teenagers were speaking to him as though he were a mentor rather than one of the most intimidating businessmen in New York. On the drive home, I found myself thinking about that. The version of Adrian I met at the gala would never have spent an entire afternoon in a room where nobody cared about status. Yet the man sitting across from me today seemed completely comfortable there. The realization bothered me, not because it was bad, because it challenged the image I worked so hard to maintain. It was easier to dislike someone when they never changed. Across the city, Adrian stood inside his office reviewing contracts when Marcus entered carrying a folder. "You have another invitation," Marcus said. Adrian barely looked up. "Decline it." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "It is the governor's private dinner." "Decline it." Marcus smiled slightly. "You skipped 3 important events this month." Adrian signed another document. "I know. People are talking." That finally earned a reaction. Adrian leaned back in his chair. "About what?" Marcus set the folder down. "About the fact that you suddenly spend more time at community centers than executive boardrooms." Adrian looked toward the window. The city stretched beneath him. For a moment, he said nothing. Then a small smile appeared. "Maybe the community centers have better people." Meanwhile, I received an unexpected call from my grandfather. "Lunch tomorrow?" he asked. "Of course." "Good." His voice sounded suspiciously pleased. That should have warned me. The next afternoon, I arrived at his favorite restaurant overlooking Central Park. The moment I entered, I realized something was wrong. My grandfather was smiling far too much. And sitting across from him was Adrian Russo. I stopped walking. Both men looked up. Neither appeared surprised. "Absolutely not," I said immediately. My grandfather laughed. Adrian looked genuinely embarrassed, which somehow made the situation even worse. Because for the first time since we met, I realized something important. Adrian was no longer trying to earn forgiveness. He was trying to earn my respect. And somehow, against all logic, he was slowly succeeding. The people who know you best are often the ones who enjoy watching you become uncomfortable. That was the only explanation for what my grandfather did next. "Sit down, Olivia," he said with far too much satisfaction. I remained standing. Adrian looked almost as uncomfortable as I felt. "I did not know he invited you," Adrian said. "I believe that," I replied. My grandfather laughed into his coffee. "Good. At least one person at this table is honest." Eventually I sat down, mostly because arguing with Charles Parker was a battle nobody won. The restaurant overlooked Central Park. Afternoon sunlight spilled across white tablecloths and polished glass windows. Normally, it was one of my favorite places in the city. Today it felt suspiciously like a trap. For the first 10 minutes, my grandfather controlled the entire conversation. Education programs, foundation projects, upcoming charity events, safe topics. Then he conveniently remembered a meeting across town. Conveniently. "I have to leave," he announced. "You absolutely do not," I replied. He ignored me. Of course he did. 5 minutes later, I was sitting alone across from Adrian Russo. The silence that followed was almost impressive. Finally, Adrian spoke. "For the record, I had no idea he planned this. I studied him carefully. You seem genuinely terrified." One corner of his mouth lifted. "I am learning that your grandfather can be intimidating." Despite myself, I laughed. The tension eased immediately. That surprised me. Months earlier, sharing a table with Adrian would have felt impossible. Now it felt merely complicated. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about business. Not about influence. About books. Family. Travel. Community projects. The things people discussed when they stopped trying to impress each other. I learned Adrian spent Sunday mornings reading historical biographies. He learned I collected old postcards from cities I had never visited. Neither fact was particularly important. Yet somehow they felt important anyway. As the conversation continued, I noticed something else. Adrian never tried to rewrite the past. He never reminded me how much he had changed. Never asked whether I forgave him. He simply showed up as the person he was trying to become. That mattered more than any speech ever could. A week later, our foundation hosted a youth leadership event in Manhattan. Hundreds of students attended. Volunteers filled the conference center. The atmosphere buzzed with energy and excitement. I spent most of the day coordinating schedules and helping speakers prepare. Near lunchtime, one of the student presenters became nervous moments before going on stage. Her hands trembled as she held her notes. Without hesitation, Adrian crouched beside her chair and spent 10 minutes encouraging her. Nobody asked him to do it. Nobody expected him to do it. He simply saw someone struggling and decided to help. Later that afternoon, I watched the same student deliver one of the strongest presentations of the day. The smile on her face afterward was impossible to miss. Adrian noticed it too. He looked genuinely proud. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not because he was powerful, not because he was wealthy, but because I finally understood that his change was real. The man who once judged people from across a ballroom now spent his time lifting them up. And as I stood there watching him encourage a room full of students, I realized I was no longer measuring him against the mistake he made. I was measuring him against the man he had become since then. And for the first time, those two people no longer seemed like the same person at all. The hardest person to forgive is often yourself. I did not realize how true that was until I saw Adrian standing alone after everyone else had gone home. The annual youth leadership event ended with applause, photographs, and dozens of excited students discussing their future plans. Volunteers packed supplies into boxes. Staff folded tables. The conference center slowly emptied. I stayed behind to review final reports and thank the last remaining volunteers. When I finally stepped outside, the evening air felt cool against my skin. The streets of Manhattan shimmered beneath the glow of streetlights. Across the parking area, I noticed Adrian standing beside his car. Alone, he was staring at the city skyline as though searching for answers hidden among the buildings. Something about the expression on his face made me stop. For months, I had watched him work to become a better man. I had seen the effort, the patience, the consistency. Yet in that moment, he looked tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. I walked toward him. He noticed me immediately. "You are still here," he said. "So are you." A faint smile appeared, then disappeared. Silence followed. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind for weeks. "Why are you trying so hard?" Adrian looked away. The city lights reflected in his eyes. "Because I do not like who I was that night." The honesty caught me off guard. He exhaled slowly. For years, I thought confidence meant having all the answers. His gaze remained fixed on the skyline. Then I met someone who showed me how dangerous certainty can be. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Adrian laughed quietly. Not from amusement, from disbelief. I spent my entire life building power. He shook his head. And somehow a 5-second mistake taught me more than 20 years of success. The words lingered between us. Real. Unfiltered. There was no audience. No reputation to protect. Just the truth. For the first time, I understood that Adrian's journey had never been about earning my forgiveness. It was about confronting the person he saw in the mirror. A few days later, my grandfather invited both of us to a small fundraising dinner at his home in Connecticut. The evening felt different from the formal events we usually attended. No reporters, no executives, no social pressure. Just family, friends, and conversations around a long dining table. At one point, my grandfather stood to give a brief speech thanking everyone for supporting the foundation. Near the end, he surprised all of us. "The future belongs to people willing to grow," he said. His eyes moved toward Adrian, especially after making mistakes. Laughter filled the room. Adrian looked mortified. I nearly choked on my water. Yet beneath the humor, everyone understood the meaning. Growth mattered. Character mattered. The ability to change mattered. Later that night, I stepped onto the back porch overlooking acres of quiet countryside. Stars filled the sky above us. The city felt very far away. Adrian joined me a few minutes later. Neither of us spoke immediately. We simply stood there listening to the wind move through the trees. Finally, he looked at me. "Do you know what scares me?" I raised an eyebrow. "The fact that I care what you think." I laughed before I could stop myself. Then I noticed he was completely serious. And somewhere between the stars above us and the silence around us, I realized that respect had quietly become something far more dangerous. It had become trust. Trust does not arrive with a grand announcement. It arrives quietly, disguised as ordinary moments that slowly become impossible to live without. After the dinner in Connecticut, something changed between Adrian and me. Not dramatically, not all at once. The world did not stop spinning. Fireworks did not appear in the sky. Instead, we simply began spending more time together. Real time, unscripted time. One Saturday morning, Adrian joined me at a community reading program in Brooklyn. Children filled the library with laughter and endless questions. The version of Adrian most people knew would have looked completely out of place there. Expensive suit, powerful reputation, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms. Yet within 20 minutes, he was sitting on a tiny chair reading stories to a group of 7-year-olds who treated him like a favorite uncle. I stood across the room watching the scene unfold and felt myself smiling. One little girl tugged on his sleeve and asked whether he was rich. Adrian glanced toward me before answering. Not rich enough to avoid difficult questions. The entire room burst into laughter, including me. Later that afternoon, we walked through a small street fair near the waterfront. No security teams, no business meetings, no charity speeches. Just two people enjoying a rare free day. As we moved through the crowd, I noticed something unexpected. People approached Adrian constantly. Shop owners greeted him. Volunteers thanked him. Students from previous programs waved excitedly. None of them spoke about his companies or his influence. They spoke about his time, his support, his presence. Somewhere along the way, he had become the kind of man who showed up when people needed him. That realization stayed with me. A few weeks later, our foundation hosted a scholarship ceremony for hundreds of students and families. It was one of the most important events of the year. The ballroom buzzed with excitement as recipients prepared to accept their awards. I spent the afternoon helping coordinate the program while Adrian met with several donors. Everything seemed perfect. Then a young scholarship recipient approached me moments before the ceremony began. She looked nervous. "Miss Parker?" she asked quietly. "Yes." She hesitated. "Can I tell you something?" I nodded. The girl smiled shyly. I almost did not apply. I thought people like me did not belong in rooms like this. The words hit me harder than she could possibly know. Because suddenly I was back at that first gala, standing alone, being judged by someone who knew nothing about me. The memory no longer hurt, but it mattered. I knelt beside her chair. "You belong anywhere your hard work takes you." Tears filled her eyes. She thanked me and walked toward the stage. When I stood again, Adrian was watching from across the room. He had heard everything. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to, because in that moment, we both understood the same thing. The mistake that brought us together had become something neither of us could have predicted. Later that evening, after the ceremony ended, Adrian and I stood on a balcony overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath us. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. If I could change that first night, I would. I smiled softly. I know. His gaze never left mine. But if I changed that night, I might never have met the woman standing here now. For a moment, the entire city seemed to disappear. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where neither of us was defined by the worst moment of our past. The day you stop trying to prove your worth is often the day you finally understand it. Nearly a year had passed since that night at the gala. A year since one careless assumption changed the course of two lives. Spring sunlight poured through the windows of the new education center as students moved through the halls carrying books, laptops, and dreams that suddenly felt possible. The center had become one of our foundation's proudest achievements. Scholarships, mentorship programs, career development workshops. Everything we once discussed around conference tables now existed in the real world. Watching it grow remained one of the greatest privileges of my life. I stood near the entrance greeting families during the center's anniversary celebration when a familiar voice spoke behind me. "You are working instead of enjoying the event." I turned and smiled immediately. Adrian stood there in a navy suit, holding 2 cups of coffee. Some things never changed. He handed one to me. "Thank you. You are welcome." For a moment, we simply watched the students moving through the building. Laughter echoed from nearby classrooms. Volunteers prepared presentations. Parents took photographs. The atmosphere felt hopeful, alive. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Adrian asked. I laughed softly. "Unfortunately." He winced. "Fair." The expression made me smile even more. A year ago, Adrian Russo would have defended himself, explained himself, Today, he simply accepted the truth. Growth looked surprisingly simple when it was genuine. Later that afternoon, my grandfather stepped onto the stage to deliver a brief speech. As always, the room listened. Charles Parker thanked donors, volunteers, and staff before pausing unexpectedly. His eyes found me. Then Adrian. A knowing smile crossed his face. That should have worried me. The success of this center, he said, exists because people were willing to learn from mistakes instead of hiding from them. The audience applauded. My grandfather continued. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is admit they were wrong and become better because of it. More applause followed. Adrian shook his head beside me. I could practically hear him wondering whether my grandfather planned these moments in advance. He probably did. After the ceremony ended, guests slowly departed. The building grew quiet. Evening sunlight painted the city gold. Adrian and I found ourselves standing on the rooftop terrace overlooking Manhattan. The skyline stretched endlessly before us. The same city, the same lights. Yet everything felt different now. I spent a long time regretting that night, Adrian said quietly. I looked at him. I know. He stared toward the horizon. Then one day I realized something. What? A small smile appeared. Regret matters only if it changes who you become afterward. Emotion tightened my throat. Because that was exactly what had happened. The powerful man who once judged a stranger across a ballroom no longer existed. In his place stood someone wiser. Kinder. More careful with the influence he carried. Adrian turned toward me fully. Meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. The words settled softly between us. Honest. Simple. Real. I smiled and took his hand. Below us, the city continued rushing through another ordinary evening. Above us, the sky glowed with the colors of sunset. Looking back, people often assumed our story was about identity, about status, about discovering who I was. They were wrong. The real story was about discovering who he could become. Because the night he underestimated me was the night he began changing himself. And in the end, the man who once lost my respect earned something far more valuable. My trust, my heart, and a future neither of us would ever take for granted.